today. All right, so I think like last time, I think Jeff, maybe you were there for like part of the half the meeting.
Yeah.
And I think last time we ended off on signing. Is that correct?
Last time we ended on how to connect the claims and the evidence and multiple attestations. So if you have so we did have a format for claims. We didn't have a format for evidence. And
Right.
Every attestation is a collection of mapping between claims and reference, or claims and evidence. And we were kind of stopping our discussion on how do we nest attestations, which is what we were.
Right. Yeah, the nesting portion. Right. Those are always fun. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. So yeah, we made some changes after you left there, Jeff. So as of now, we've got this higher level concept called declarations. And then declarations has requirements. And then it has the attestations themselves. And then it also has, is that right? Yeah, it has the claims and I think we were still talking about whether or not we should include the evidence or part. Yeah, I don't know if that was.
Yeah, we were going
yet.
back and forth a little bit on where should we nest what, where should we map things together for what. That's kind of where we were going back and forth to try and gain an understanding, because evidence could be reusable for multiple attestations.
Yeah, I was just going
Right.
to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of where we're at. So we've got the requirements up here. The requirements can be should that be there?
No, I don't.
Not
I don't
anymore.
think.
Not
Can you
anymore.
clarify the difference between a requirement and a claim? I would have said that they were the same thing.
I think that was actually in the original one, and we were
Yeah.
struggling a little bit with that last week as well. So we're saying, okay, the requirements, we're trying to standardize some of the nouns on it. Requirements are really what you need to meet a certain spec, a certain standard. And then the attestations are going to be the collection of things that will hopefully map us to that. Meaning, we make a claim that we meet this requirement or these series of requirements. Here is the evidence then that supports that claim, for example. And that's what
Right.
that map is that starts on line 44. And I think that this was where we were talking about this back and forth. This was not an assertion like we were all saying this is a great idea. This was, we were exploring this concept and seeing if this would work well or not.
Right, exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I could foresee it like you have basically like a requirements bomb that just has the requirements section filled out that someone who's maybe an assessor has put together, and then you have subsequent bombs that are merged in and as the evidence has been brought forth by different parties.
Yeah, and it gives us an opportunity as well for somebody like somebody who has one of these standards to come up and put that bomb together of the requirements. Then we can start, programmatically trying to reach those things out. I don't know if anybody would do that, if that's something that maybe an open source group might take on. But, those types of things could be very handy to be able to share those.
Yeah.
So
I like the decoupling of the requirements versus the attestation. I think there's a lot of use cases that's going to be able to achieve.
we might use the attestation form that CISA released this week as sort of a test case. I mean, it basically lays out some requirements. It says their attestation requirements, and then each one of those actually maps to SSDF requirements, which then you would have to support. So it's a relatively complex structure to try to model, see if we can make it work. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll put a link to it. If you haven't seen it, you should take a look. I'll put a link to it in the chat here.
Yeah, I know many people are going to be providing feedback too. I know there's a group in OWASP, ASVS, I think they're going to be providing some feedback. I know others are as well. A lot of people
Yeah.
aren't happy with that form as is.
I mean, I don't, it's fine. It basically says you got to do all the stuff in the SSDF. It's
No,
funny
it
the way they
doesn't.
did it. They didn't just say do the stuff in the SSDF. They basically created like a bunch of meta requirements and then map them to what ends up being almost
That's-
all requirements in the SSDF.
Almost right, exactly.
And the ones they're missing don't make sense. Like they're missing like in some cases, I just kind of went through it to look at it. They're missing like,
Security requirements.
well, yeah, but I mean, they've got like, a higher number requirement in a category, but not the lower numbered requirements in that same category, which is weird, like requirements, stuff like that. I don't know. But
Yeah, it's odd.
yeah, it's a little odd, but I don't care actually, like for the purposes of this effort, like whatever they say the requirements are, we ought to be able to model them here.
Agreed. And I think there's some at the very top, right? You can on that form. I think you can do it on a per product basis, product family basis. I think on a per company basis, and I thought there was like one other thing in there as well.
I thought it was just product or product line. I don't think you
Product
can do
line, right? Yeah.
Oh, it does say, it actually does say there's a company-wide product line, individual project, or multiple products or specific product versions, and you can like sort of fill it out.
Right.
But so I imagine most people are just going to say, company-wide, I do this everywhere, done. Sign it.
Yeah.
There's also a concept of waiver introduced in the form. So is that something which we want to model in the attestation?
Let's
Jeff
see.
was kind of, I believe, going down that whole mitigation strategy. Because I mean, isn't it it's not the assessor that, well, I mean, the person, the organization who is self-attesting, they're not the one to actually waive, although they would come up with a mitigation strategy for non or partial compliance.
Or is that a separate part of this? Like Vex is separate for a reason. And I don't know if we want to include that baked in here or not. But it's a thought.
Yeah. Well, we've got the conformance, which can be partial. And then we've got the, let's see, for confidence, we've got a mitigation strategy, I guess.
I think we pulled that up as a thought for what should be there, as we were talking about like doing the mappings in the attestation blog.
Yeah, I think this is where I can push for, hey, be in line with maybe the Nintendo attestation framework, maybe not the full attestation, but at least the attestation framework. And then this is where we could have a specific predicate that defines like this area. So then there's alignment here with a lot of, I think, the other tooling that's kind of coming out.
Well, this whole attestation format could very easily be a predicate. So this whole thing
Correct.
could be. We could also talk about possibly doing some nesting of it in the long run, where we could have sub predicates, for lack of a better term, or multiple predicates to support that. That's where I was kind of thinking that based on what you were saying earlier with the requirements bomb, basically, right? You could sign that and publish that out and have that be visible publicly. That would be a very useful thing. And then maybe that's part of what we talk about with our spec as this grows, is yes, there's an intent to enable specific slices of functionality here. Because the other one that we talked about that's semi-related is if we're trying to send this externally rather than to a trusted third party like an auditor, that we would want to pull out a lot of the lower level claims or the lower level evidence, because we wouldn't want to share that kind of confidential internal material externally. So I think we need to be explicit once we've agreed to what this is and the formats, that we specifically mention that we're trying to enable that functionality.
Yeah. So Jeff, one of the things that came, I guess, clear to me during last week's meeting is being able to pull these requirements out into their individual BOMs. We could theoretically, because, I think ASVS, SCVS, and OWASP SAM are all included in SSDF. So each one of those OWASP projects could in fact have their own requirements BOM, right? That would be machine readable and all interoperable with one another. And likewise, if Synopsys ever wanted to do it for BSIM or whomever, they could obviously do that as well.
A graph that says, here's how I meet SSDF, and then here's how I meet ASVS, and here's how I meet BSIM, and you pull those into one master BOM that has your whole argument in it.
Yep.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
It also gives you that nice point in time snapshot as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one thing that we haven't figured out yet is the obviously the nesting, and because we had like claims and subclaims, I think.
There were subclaims, but we were talking about pulling that out because we didn't understand why subclaims were a thing. Wouldn't it just be a claim talking about a specific requirement or a sub requirement instead?
Right.
So the
Jeff,
idea here, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to see if Jeff had any opinion on that.
Well, I don't think we have to call anything a subclaim. I think we should recognize the fact that claims are hierarchical. And some requirements documents are set up in a way that they're hierarchical, but not all are like that. Many are just kind of flat, but I think we want to be able to model the way that people meet requirements. Sometimes, you would want to make multiple claims to show how you met a particular top level claim. And each one of those have subclaims. So
I think that's what we were trying to break out here, though. So if you take a look at the way that we were structuring it, the map, we didn't have a good term for this, but if you could scroll down back to line 44 there, we were saying basically there's this one requirement that could be as high level or granular as the spec that it's coming from is. And then we have an array of claims where there's a claim and one or more pieces of evidence that map to that. So I think that's where we were suggesting the hierarchy would come from, was mapping into that requirement level. And so you're suggesting that might not work.
Well, I think
all I'm
what he's
saying
saying
is that
is
requirement level is just a claim. Like, to me, a requirement is a claim.
Right, but you said the requirement stocks are hierarchical, and we should model the hierarchy of the requirement stocks, correct?
Well, no, that's just I think people may want to create one of these attestations that doesn't follow a particular standard.
Right, but they'll still have their own internal requirement that they're trying to meet. And I think that was the distinction between what's a requirement and what's a claim. A requirement is something that a a external entity or an internal entity like your compliance team says, this is a requirement we must abide by, then the person who's trying to make sure that we're doing that is saying, we are claiming that we abide by this requirement. Here is our evidence to that. So that's kind of the hierarchy I think that we were talking about last time.
So like in this particular example,
Yeah.
right, we've got the standard, which is this, and then we've got the identifier, which is item number 1, section C, sub item 3, right? I think what we're suggesting here is maybe to model like, well, what was number 1 versus what was C and what was number 3 in that particular hierarchy.
Well, I don't think that everything has to be driven based on some external entity's notion of what the right requirements for you as your business are. I think it's fine for a business to set out a set of claims. Maybe they're written policies that they have internally, maybe they're engineering decisions, maybe they're just preferences, but they state how security is supposed to work. And then the evidence tells you how security actually works. I don't think we need an extra level of distinction between a requirement and a claim. We could have a source for the claim, like this comes from SSDF or whatever, but I really think they're the same thing if you look at them real hard.
I kind of see where you're coming from, but I also do want to counter that. To me, a requirement and a claim should be two different things, and I'd actually say that maybe we want to have, lesser separation between the claim and the evidence, so that we kind of flatten out that we're making a claim and I'm backing up my claim using the evidence, and I'm meeting this requirement, which is a separate thing.
I'm not sure I understand. What do you think the difference between a requirement and a claim and evidence are?
To me, the difference between a requirement and a claim is the word requirement itself. It kind of maps to the policy I'm supposed to follow. Depending on context, the type of policy is going to change, but a requirement to me sounds more like the policy I'm supposed to follow. And the claim is me saying I'm following this policy and here's the proof, that's the evidence. So me saying I'm following this policy or this requirement is meaningless without the evidence, which is why I'm saying that maybe the claim and evidence are kind of more linked together than claim and requirement are. And that we should in fact keep the requirement and claim separate rather than trying to conflate the two.
I think we talked about having evidence that could be used for multiple claims last.
I agree with
Last
that. I'm
time.
not saying that we should get away with those two fields. I'm just saying that in our mental model, if we're trying to say that two of these terms are actually much closer than you'd think, then it's more likely to be claim and evidence than requirement and claim.
So
Right,
maybe
right.
it would help if you gave me an example of a requirement and a claim.
So a requirement could be that you separate roles, or no, let's do the MFA one, that you require MFA access to your dev and production environments. The claim
Sure.
would be that could be the requirement. Then the claim would be, yes, we do that, right? We're saying that we do that.
That's really the only difference then, right? Is one says, here's the abstract requirement, and the other one is I do that requirement.
Right, but you could, yes, but you could have,
So it's-
5 different standards that have that requirement. You might want to meet all 5 of those standards. So you could have an internal policy that does that. You could have an external requirement that does that. You'd want to map the claims to those requirements somehow.
Sure. I mean, to me, it's really the exact same statement. I do MFA for, to separate production access or something. That's a claim that I make. It's a requirement that
It's a
on me.
question and an answer. The requirement is a question and the claim is the answer. I agree that the claim in itself is
it's
just a
not.
restating of this question, but that's where the evidence comes in. It's
To me,
like,
it's
do you
about-
do MF? Sorry, go ahead, Ian.
No, I'm in agreement with you. I think it's a question about identity, right?
Right, so let's
I-
have a field that says what's the source of this claim?
So I think part of that comes down to signing, right? So I would
That's the
expect to be able
evidence.
to sign the requirement separate than signing the claim.
That's also a good point. So it's again the disambiguation between like the policy side of things and the actual claim and evidence side of things. Like someone sets the requirements and they may be able to sign that. The person setting the requirements may be able to sign that. And the person making the claim saying, hey, I do meet this requirement and here's a piece of evidence. They sign the evidence, right? So we have like the separation between who's setting the requirements and who's meeting the requirements, and we're able to validate that with the evidence that and all of that. And more generally
So
speaking, I'm a little worried that the use of the word requirement to mean claim can be a little confusing, like, in the broader context for these, like, this kind of metadata.
So,
Well, let's put a pin for it. But I think
just a quick note.
I sort of
Sorry.
see what you're saying. I sort of see what you're saying. It's like I'm making the claim, but I'm importing that, what I'm claiming from some standard, right? So I want to be able to make a claim on my own though. Like I only use, type safe languages or whatever the claim I want. Like it might not be required anywhere, but it's something that I want to add to my assurance
And-
case, that my security story. So
And-
I feel like if I import a requirement from somewhere, then that's fine. I get the requirement that I have to do, MFA.
I mean, you could make that claim regardless of the requirement, right?
Yeah.
You could make that claim that you use only type safe languages. You could make that claim regardless of tying it back to a specific requirement. You'd still have evidence,
Well,
and you'd still have disambiguation of the terms we're using.
Well, not according to the structure I'm seeing here, right? It
No,
looks
so
like
this is
you
a
have a-
claim ref.
have a
So maybe that's,
requirement.
yeah, the claim in the array here is a link down to claims in a claims array down below. So if you look down a little bit here on 65, this is where we actually define the claim itself. That other section was specifically within the attestation piece where we're saying this claim, this evidence maps to this requirement, and then the assessor is saying that. But we can itemize however many claims we want down below. I believe we did the same thing with evidence, where the evidence can also be separate down below in a separate section. This is just where we're literally mapping
But
the thing together.
Sorry. Right. I want to make sure we're talking the same terms. You said evidence maps to requirement. Evidence maps to claims. Like a claim can be based on a requirement.
If I said that, I misspoke. If you scroll down a little further, I think below claims, we had the evidence array. That's 79. So evidence can also be explicitly provided here, even if it doesn't map to anything. So we can collect a lot of different things within this one document, but that section up above that we were looking at is specifically how we were trying to build a relation between them. And then that relation was the actual attestation piece.
Yeah,
is
the
what we were-
idea was using attestation as a place where you relate a requirement to a claim and the evidence. So the attester is saying, I've used the requirement to map it to a claim and there's evidence to it. So that is the attestation.
Yeah, that way our claims and evidence can be reused.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Did we want to
Give me
I'm kind
one-
of curious to, sorry to interrupt. I'm kind of curious on a detail what you were talking about kind of like requirements versus attestations. To me, it is kind of a policy type discussion. I know you're coming from an academic kind of background here, but how would you approach that problem of, hey, I have things that I need to test you. I know I'm familiar with like, the layout files, but like Mentodo doesn't really have the equivalent of like an open policy engine right now. I know some folks are working on it, but how would you approach the same problem of saying like this idea of a requirement versus an attestation? Or how is
That's
that
a-
Mentodo?
That's a good question, and that did cross my mind as I was speaking about it a few minutes ago, and it's still something I want to think about. I wonder if there's room for like what we're essentially describing here, right? Let's set aside the in-total verification engine. What we're really describing here is perhaps a way to communicate just the requirements that you have signed by, whoever's setting the policy, and another predicate that's essentially just the claims and the evidence that you then just kind of tie together in a more of a custom verification workflow than what in-total is currently built to support, right? And that would be my approach, and maybe something like the SALSA VSA, the verification summary, that kind of takes the two inputs together, the requirements document and the claims plus evidence document, and maps them out, and that workflow also needs to be aware of, for this requirement, is this an acceptable piece of claim and evidence, checks that everything looks okay, and maybe summarizes it as the VSA, saying this requirement was met by this claim and this evidence, and so on. But that's, I think, I think that's the kind of separation we should try and target at a high level.
Yeah, one of the use cases that I have is other than compliance stuff, is like OWASP ASVS. So there's hundreds of requirements in ASVS. We have an internal policy that says, for any given release of software, thou shall meet ASVS level 2, sometimes higher. And this would give us a way to have the requirements separate from the actual attestations. The attestations in our case will be provided by a third party. So. Along with all the evidence that they found. Jeff brought up a point earlier about the hierarchical relationships of requirement stocks. Should we try to have a parent-child relationship here for requirements so that we can model, for example, the text for this, and then the text for C, and then the text for 3.
Can we overload reference for that? Can a reference be internal and external?
And a reference, you mean one of these bomb refs?
Yeah, the bomb ref, can it be an
Yes.
external reference? So in that
Yes.
case, you refer to an external document, which is which is defining the hierarchy, like the document structure can be the hierarchy instead of having all the hierarchy within a single document.
Well, you'd want to have everything together, like all the requirements in one place.
Yeah, it could be as easy as like literally having a field parent. And
Exactly.
one parent always, but multiple children. So you could have a parent field and a child array.
Sorry, what's the end goal with doing that? What do we get by actually representing it in a in a hierarchical way? Or I'm trying to understand how it helps us with the claims and the evidence.
I don't think it strictly speaking does. It's just another thing from an organizational perspective. Like requirements will be hierarchical. They almost always are. And then this lets us model the requirement more accurately. Going to your previous comment, though, that might be something we want to keep separate in a separate document or a separate format. But I think just trying to think through this all in one place right now might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a
Right.
case where, a human a human auditor is going to be using a website or whatever, a form, and they need to be able to navigate a particular requirement instead of seeing a list of 500 things. Maybe they just want to expand the first thing here and then work off the things in the first thing. And then
Or you
move
want
their
to
way
give a
down.
list of requirements to a particular group within the organization to generate the evidence and the claims. You'd want an
Right.
easy way to export that and anything below it. So that's kind of where the parent-child relationships come in from the requirement and trying to actually implement it somehow.
Interesting. I think we need that kind of, the semantic mapping outside of all of this, to be honest. You'd want the requirements, like this thing here, for example, to be kind of aware of that, so that there's also some degree of standardization. Otherwise, we don't want, two tools generating the same kind of attestations for a particular requirement to embed the parent-child relationships and emit the parent-child relationships and slightly different ways that they're not compatible with and things like that. So there's probably like a sub project here where you take these standards and their requirements and you set up that hierarchy and kind of standardize the standardizing of the
Yeah,
parent-child
that doesn't
mapping.
exist currently, though, right? So I think there was
Right.
one person who was on the first call who mentioned that there was a project that they were trying to start doing some of that mapping, like between the different standards and organizations. I think that's a great thing. But what do we do now? And I think it's a good question. Do we need to capture the parent-child relationship here, or do we really just want to capture the requirement?
Yeah, I think that
we were
mapping
doing
project is,
the world a huge service. I think we would be doing the world a huge service if we allow the parent requirements to be articulated. Right now, many organizations lose the context for security requirements, and they end up doing really stupid things because they lost the thread of why that requirement is there in the first place. And I'm hoping that this structure that we're proposing isn't just a list of requirements, but allows people to track the rationale for that requirement back to the reason, the business purpose for why we're doing that requirement in the first place.
Yeah,
So-
true traceability.
Yeah, the traceability towards the parents makes sense. Do we want to have a children as well? Like, do you want to? Because I mean, for me, children is a way of defining new requirements within the organization. So parent can exist when children don't, and as children are created, you can map it up to a parent. But
Yeah, I don't think we need that.
I don't think we do either. I mean, it's just another way to represent it, but you can figure out the children without it.
yeah,
And just calling out that Spyros had his hand up for a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
Thanks, Derek. No worries, Steve. Derek, you said someone was on the first call who had like a project to structure requirements.
That was you, wasn't
me.
it?
Yeah. So a little bit of internal information about CRE. End of this month, we're releasing kind of a revamped, like more complete kind of requirements list with way more CREs. And I'm going to repeat what I said in the very first call when we went down this path of how do we structure requirements? If you, instead of structuring requirements, if you just add the CRE there, then you can use the CRE structure, which is quite well thought of and maps to different standards. And then it doesn't really matter which standard you try to show or which requirements you're trying to show. People can click a link or go to one singular place and find any standard they need. And you automatically map to every standard we know about. And if we don't know about that standard, we would be happy to add it. And as a bonus, we're not a company, we're like supported by OWASP, we are an OWASP Foundation project. So it's not that we're going anywhere.
Right. So when do you release? You said you're releasing 1.0 soon.
So we're releasing. We have 1.0. We're releasing 2.0 by the end of this month, and with, well, I guess, yeah, and we're releasing 2.0 at the end of this month with way more mappings and a few more features. So it should now cover not only technical standards that we had in the past, like ASVS and things like that, but now it covers all of NIST and the Cloud Security Alliance CCM mapping and stuff like this.
Nice. Okay. Well, definitely keep the group updated on that release.
Yeah, so from a workflow perspective, though, the only thing I would be concerned about, I think, from only linking out to OpenCRE would be then that our bomb needs to be digested while connected to the network while it has information from OpenCRE. Unless maybe we adopt the linking standard or the way that data is represented in this document here. Right. So if we're going to the high security disconnected network perspective, the bomb needs to stand alone. I don't think it would work to get the relationships from OpenCRE specifically. I think we need to embed that somehow here. Or do we? Is this something where we just need to look at the requirements that we're claiming we meet, and then, you know, that doesn't matter, and maybe it is a separate function or a separate tool, you know, to be able to visualize them, see the hierarchies or different things. I'm not sure which way, but I'd throw that out there for some thought and conversation.
Well, I think the you know, one thing that we talked about was not doing the mappings here. And when I refer to mappings, I'm saying that, you know, this requirement over here is the same thing as this requirement over here. And I think we got rid of that idea, and
We did.
we were just going to do this CRE. This map right here is not meant for mapping requirements, just mapping for claims and evidence to requirements.
Right, but we were talking the parent-child relationship specifically, right? And to try to understand the hierarchy of the requirements. And I think
that's still valid to put in here. And if somebody does use CRE, then that's, you know, going to be even better for them. Now, in disconnected networks, obviously, we need to be able to fall back gracefully, right? It should not be a hard requirement, in my opinion.
I mean, I'd almost go as far as to say maybe we want especially since it's another OWASP project, maybe we want a CRE field here to link to it separately. So we can have a URI field to link to perhaps the requirement itself, or a web page with the requirements, you know, analysis itself. But we explicitly say that there's a CRE link that talks about this in a very low level. Right. I'm not sure. I'm still thinking about that idea too, but that might be something we want to have.
Yeah, I kind of like that. Then you've got the official link to the official standard, but you've also got like a more useful link from the CRE.
Yeah. And we can talk about what's required, what's optional later, but I think that calling that out as a separate thing would be very valuable in the long run. I know personally that when we were looking to go into organizations and do, you know, analyses for multiple requirement sets across, you know, multiple stakeholders, it was always a real pain. So if we had something like the OpenCRE that we could easily map these things to, that would have saved us so much time.
Should they?
Two places where I was, they were talking about building that system internally just to make their lives easier.
Should it be more generic though? Like, should we attach ourselves to OpenCRE, or is it more a generic description URI, which is optional, so that any internal user can point it to internal wiki?
Yeah, that's where I'm going back and forth, because it's more than just a generic URI. It's a specific URI for mapping. Here's how this requirement maps across other collections of requirements. So maybe we do want a more generic field here for that, but that's kind of the intent. Is it's not just a URI with the requirements details, it's specifically how it maps to other ones. That's where the value is, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it gives more visibility to the CRE project as well. A lot of people don't know about it. So if they see this, they'll be like, oh, what's that? And you know, hopefully that can bring some more contributors to that project as well, because it seems to be pretty valuable, especially with 2.0 coming out, sounds like. Question. So we've got an array of requirements. And like if we do like the requirements of OMB 2218, for example, that would be like the standard, for example. They're all going to say the same thing. They're all going to say OMB 2218. And more than likely, they're all going to have the exact same URLs. Should we separate the standards out and then say that these requirements are for this standard, or is that too much normalization?
That's actually really interesting, because I think that addresses one of Jeff's concerns earlier, specifically of what about external versus internal requirements and stuff. It becomes very clear, like whether it's a ref to an external standard or whether it's a ref to an internal policy, then if we break it out
Right.
like that.
Right. Okay, so that would leave us with something like this, maybe. Just I cannot type today. Oh my God. Oh,
Clearly, you need to enable the AI autocompletes.
seriously. Seriously. Oh my. Okay. So, and this is also going to have a bomb ref. And this is going to be like OMB 2018. So then we could do something like
Standard ref.
Yeah. So it'd be something like that then. Now I'm missing a thing here. So this requirement then has its own identity. It then is a part of this particular standard. That standard also has an identity. It has a name. It has a source. So if it's an internal thing, you could say, you know, Acme, whatever.
Right.
And then the relationship and hierarchy is by the requirement level.
Right. Not the standard level.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now, why do we have signature in the requirements here? I don't remember why we put that in there. Oh, before we change gears, does that make sense for everybody? Sorry.
Signing an individual requirement? I don't know. I think signing a standard makes a lot of sense.
And we kind of thought of requirements as a set of policies coming from an entity, right? So we wanted to understand who the entity was. That's where the signature comes in, right? So collection of requirements makes sense. I guess the collection of requirements is defined as standard here. So,
yeah.
Yeah, I want to plus one that I think it makes more sense to put all the requirements in a document and then sign the document as a whole rather than signing individual requirements. If you've got different requirements coming from different entities, they probably don't belong there together anyway.
So it sounds like
How would I do this if this was an internal standard? Like if I had a secure coding guideline for my project.
you do in the standards, you do secure coding guidelines, you'd give it a bomb ref. The source would
Acme
be
secure coding guideline or whatever.
Yep. And the URL would be the link to the page internally that has those. And then you could describe them out in your requirements below. And going back to what Aditya there suggested, maybe there is a case to pull the standards and requirements out into their own thing that we could then reference. But going to what we started with as a core requirement here was that we really wanted to convey the entire point in time snapshot of what we were doing and where we were to an external third party. So I mean, if it's cryptographically signed, I think that's fine. It might make it easier to digest, especially in the isolated networks perspective, if it was all in one location or all within one document. Otherwise, you'd be sending multiple documents over, which is probably okay too. But thrown out again, just trying to bring up some of the use cases we talked about with that scenario.
I think, like, given if we expect this to have mass adoption, we can't move away from multiple documents being shipped. Like, if I think about the Windows operating system, I don't like having all the different dependencies being shipped as a single document. I kind of doubt that would be possible. But yeah, I mean, anyway, so that I think we should work towards a world where we keep that multiple documents possible.
Yeah, and in that world, I really love the idea of, hey, if this gets widespread adoption, then maybe the people who are actually coming up with the standards write the darn things to begin with and give us the schema and everything else out there. I mean, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I actually was thinking, like, we should encourage standards organizations to stop publishing requirements as Excel documents. And how about giving it to me as, requirements as code?
So
I think you just invented a new thing, Jeff. Requirements of code.
It is. It's what it is. That's what we're doing here. Requirements as code.
So to that end, do we want to take a step back again for a second, look at the use cases we originally talked about and say, maybe we do want two separate standards here. Maybe we do want a standard for requirements that lists out the standard itself with the requirements, how they map, the hierarchy of them. And then we want our claims and attestation standard to be another that goes along with it, and they're designed to be used together.
That sounds about right to me. That I think, I mean, I of course, with my Toto hat on, I've always been thinking of them as predicate types, and it makes sense for me to think of all of the requirements as going in one predicate type and being accompanied by one or more claims predicate type documents that may also map out to other predicates that contain specific evidences. But yeah, that's kind of how I've thought about it. And to be fair, a lot of the evidences are going to be in different documents anyway. So I don't think we can, like I think Manoj also mentioned, we always have a multiple document scenario here.
I think in a lot of cases, you're going to have just a single document though, like look at the SSTF. I mean, if that ever gets machine readable format other than, something like a PDF, that's just going to be one document. I mean, and the SSTF doesn't require all the evidence.
But I think that's what they're saying is, like, there'd be a JSON version of the SSTF requirements. And if I wanted to make like the document that says contrast meets the SSTF, I would just include it at the top of my SBOM, say like,
right.
Include it, and then I'll just provide my evidence here, and I'll use the standards refs to the individual requirements.
Yep.
Or maybe the requirements refs.
Yeah, and to Ian's point from the last session around, isolated networks, again, you're going to load that standard into that network somehow, and then you're going to want to take a look at your package that's coming in to say, do I meet that standard before I can be run? So, I mean, it works in that scenario too. It just has to be checked against the internal version of it instead of the external, which I think is acceptable. So I think that will work for all of the use cases we've talked about so far.
So to conclude this, like, are we moving towards a separate document or a separate JSON for standards and requirements? Is that, like, that's where we started? So just wanted to kind of get the conclusion there. I like the idea of having the standards and requirements as a separate document. And for me, it's a policy definition. And attestation is an evaluation of that policy against claims
Mhm. I
So-
like it. I think it works well.
Were we gonna move that signature block up to the standard block rather than it signing an individual requirement?
I think now that we're having this conversation, we may actually want to refactor this a little bit in general. So we may want to have a standard and then a list of requirements below that standard and enforce like multiple routes from that perspective. But then the
Yes.
standard itself would be the thing that is signed. So we would basically
Okay,
take
yeah,
like
yeah,
an,
that's it.
yeah,
Yep.
we would take an envelope approach, and then each standard would be its own signed envelope, which is a collection of requirements then, right, with their parents declared.
Yeah, I'll just say signed or unsigned. Like, I think we gotta have, you shouldn't have to sign it because a lot of people may not be capable, but anybody should be able to create a standard.
Sorry, this is a stupid question. When we say sign, what do you consider signing? Is it, so you're gonna take the standard plus requirements and the entire text gets signed as part of CycloneDX, or are you talking about, generating a SHA of a standard HTML document and embedding a SHA
Like
in here and then signing that?
So I was originally talking about the DSE signatures and the envelope format that's being used over in Intoto was my original intent, but
Okay.
we could talk about whichever one makes sense. And to Jeff's point, I think it does make sense to not require it to be signed. Although
Sure,
if we're going to be in a high security world where we want to make sure someone should sign at some point that, we're meeting this version of something.
I'm much more concerned that somebody signs the attestations and
Yeah.
that they sign the standards, like the standards, anybody can go back and check to see if someone tampered with it or something.
Well,
But
can they? I think that's an assumption. I honestly think that at the very least, we should have a SHA for the version of the standard. There should at least be a hash, if not a full signature. I can totally understand not having a signature with the cryptographic infrastructure there and the questions for how that's done. But I really do think we should at the very least have a signature that can be included in our attestation document saying that we are going to this particular version of this signature at this time.
I'm in complete agreement on that one.
I'm not really, I don't think it hurts anything, but I'm not really seeing the threat there. You have to threat model that one for me.
Derek, are you saying that the claims document should contain a hash of the standards document?
If we're saying that we agree to something that is an external source that can be changed at any point in time by somebody updating a website or something, yeah, I think that we should have a hash of that thing that we're saying we are meeting. And if it's an external thing that is a version controlled JSON file of a standard, I think that should have a hash along with it, and we should be referencing that. To me, this is the same kind of an issue with what was it, item potency in the build process. If you're referencing an external build script, you don't know what you're actually including at that point in time. You don't know what you're actually saying you're going to run or that you ran.
I get that. I'm just a little, sorry, I haven't fully thought this out in this context, but I'm just, generally speaking, I'm a little nervous of the claims mapping to the policy rather than the other way around. Like the claims shouldn't be responsible for identifying the policy they adhere to, because the assumption is that you trust the person or the parties setting the policy more than you trust the parties making the claim that they meet the policy. So, but again, I haven't thought of that in this context very specifically, but I wanted to put that out there.
But I mean, instead of thinking of from the claimer's perspective, thinking from an attested, like attesters, like whoever attests this document, they can only attest to a specific version of the standard. So how do we encode version is a good question. It could be a SHA, it could just be a version.
Yeah, and that's where I'm trying to take it to the next level in my model, where we're saying like, yeah, it could be version 2, but what's to say the organization or a third party didn't make a change to that version 2, and it just didn't get populated out properly? Because ultimately, if it's a document that exists on a website, it can be changed by anyone who has access to that site. To Jeff's point earlier, I don't know how much that really matters in this particular instance. Maybe just saying, hey, we're version 2 of this particular standard is fine. But That was
I've
my
seen it
initial
happen enough.
reaction, was that.
I've seen it happen enough internally within my company where I'll say standard, but like software requirement specifications where they change over time and do not get revved correctly. And so having somebody to identify that would be beneficial.
Maybe having it as an optional, right? And maybe not being
Yeah,
required.
an optional
but
pass should be
field.
great.
Well,
Yeah.
I see we're at time, but and maybe we can pick this up next week. I'm just still a little nervous because at verification time you'd have the requirements document anyway. So it doesn't matter if your claims document claims that it met a prior version of the requirements document because you now want it to meet the current version of the requirements document, right? So the claims document kind of becomes worthless anyway, and you'd have to go back and regenerate your claims to meet the new set of requirements. So
Okay.
I think it depends on definition of document, right? Are we saying that the listed requirements here and their standard, that is what is signed and that is what is that is what we're trying to I guess drive consistency with? Or is it that plus the document that's being linked to? Like what exactly is the unique set of things that we're going to be trying to have attestation to?
right.
I'm sorry, it's a nuance about like people writing Word documents and then trying to make that machine readable. And the Word document can change over time and be revised. And how we drive consistency here? And maybe the answer is we don't. And that's
I
okay.
agree. I just think that the solution is perhaps not driven in this direction, but it should in fact be the other direction. We can pick this up the next time.
Yeah, I think the important thing here is that like we all seem to agree pretty solidly now that the standard and requirements should be separated out into a different document. And then we're going to be referencing that. There's other nuances and concerns there for sure. But like that seems to be, we're all pretty comfortable with that at this point and think it could actually enable a lot of good stuff.
Very good. Yeah, great. Good
Yeah, that's good
conversations
progress.
today. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and check this in and look forward to next week's conversation where we'll pick it up.
Great chat.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, Bill.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.